In the late hours of October 15, 2022, tragedy struck at a Pittsburgh gas station. A 20-year-old man lost his life in a hail of bullets. Around 3 p.m., police rushed to reports of multiple drive-by shootings at the Suno gas station on Cedar Avenue. When officers arrived, they were met with a chilling scene: 3 people lying motionless on the roadside. Each had been struck by multiple gunshots. Just 13 days later, as friends and family gathered for the funeral of one of the victims, grief turned into horror once again. A masked gunman stormed into the service and opened fire on the mourners, determined to take more lives. What should have been a solemn farewell suddenly descended into chaos. And yet, the violence didn't end there. What followed would spiral into something darker than anyone could have imagined. This is the life and tragic death of John James Hornis. Born in 2002 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, John James Hornis Jr. was still in the early chapters of his story. At just 20 years old, he carried a future full of promise, a quiet strength, a kind heart, and a love for life that touched those around him. Friends and family described him as selfless, the kind of person who would give you his last dollar, defend you without hesitation, or brighten your day with a simple smile. Basketball was his passion. Whether shooting hoops at the neighborhood park or watching his favorite NBA team, the game wasn't just a pastime, it was his therapy, his outlet, his way of finding focus in an unforgiving world. Like many young men his age, John was navigating the uncertain path of adulthood, trying to balance responsibility, personal struggles, and the weight of an environment that could be both unstable and dangerous. Yet through it all, he showed resilience. He dreamed of a steady life, one filled with peace and security, not only for himself, but for the family and friends he loved. To those closest to him, John was more than just a young man. He was a brother, a son, and a loyal friend. Behind his calm demeanor was someone who laughed loudly, loved deeply, and carried himself with purpose, even when life made that difficult. But on October 15, 2022, everything changed. What began as an ordinary day for John would soon turn into something unimaginable, a tragedy that would shake his community to its core. John had arranged to meet up with 2 close friends that afternoon. The 3 of them later gathered at the Sunoco gas station on Cedar Avenue. It was nothing unusual, just friends waiting at a bus stop, deciding where to head next. They had no reason to think danger was near, but in just moments, the ordinary scene turned into chaos. As the group stood on the sidewalk, an SUV crept slowly past. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a passing vehicle. Then, without warning, gunfire erupted. Surveillance footage later revealed the chilling truth. John and his 2 friends suddenly pulled out their weapons and opened fire on the SUV. The vehicle was riddled with bullets as the trio unleashed a barrage of shots. But what they hadn't expected was what came next. The people inside the SUV were armed too, and they weren't about to back down. In an instant, bullets were flying both ways. The quiet street transformed into a battleground. Witnesses scattered for cover, ducking behind gas pumps and parked cars as the crossfire intensified. What started as an ambush spiraled into a full-scale shootout. The cameras also captured something even more heartbreaking. Just feet away, 2 women who had been waiting for the bus, completely uninvolved in the altercation, were struck by stray bullets. Both collapsed to the pavement as the gunfight raged on. In the middle of the chaos, John James Hornis Jr. was hit by a bullet fired back from the SUV. One of his friends was also struck in the leg, though he survived. 911 calls poured in within seconds. Police and first responders rushed to the scene, working frantically to save the wounded. CPR was performed, stretchers rolled, and victims were rushed to the hospital. But for 20-year-old John, and for the 2 innocent bystanders, Betty Jean Everett and Jacqueline Mahalik, it was too late. All 3 were pronounced dead shortly after arrival. Investigators quickly determined this wasn't a random act. According to police, a dispute had sparked the deadly exchange of gunfire between John's group and the SUV's occupants. Days later, 19-year-old Chiron Troutman, allegedly one of the shooters inside the SUV, was arrested and charged with homicide for John's death. Meanwhile, 21-year-old Jalen Hines, who was shot in the leg during the chaos and accused of firing alongside John, was charged with the murders of the two women caught in the crossfire. Authorities alleged the group had been engaged in reckless gang-related violence that claimed 3 lives in a matter of minutes. When police recovered John's body near a playground, a handgun was still by his side, a stark reminder of how quickly an afternoon with friends had turned into a tragedy that shattered a community. Jacqueline Mahalik and Betty Everett never made it home that night. They were simply waiting at a bus stop, innocent bystanders caught in the chaos. For their families, the grief was unbearable. One relative shared through tears, "My mother lived in the high-rise on the north side. That wasn't just a bus stop, she'd been part of that community for 5 years. She was a resident, not just a passerby. And now she's gone." As the community struggled to process the shock, the pain was only beginning. Because the ripple effect of this tragedy wouldn't fully reveal itself until the day of John Hornis's funeral. When news of John's death reached his family, it shattered them. To investigators, he was just another young man caught in a shootout. But to his loved ones, he was more than that: a son, a brother, a friend. He had dreams, flaws, and a future he was still trying to build. Despite their heartbreak, the family came together to give John the farewell they believed he deserved. Plans were made, flowers chosen, obituaries printed. On October 28, 2022, friends and family gathered at the Destiny of Faith Church on Brighton Road in Pittsburgh. Over 100 mourners filled the sanctuary. Some prayed, some cried, while others quietly reflected on the life that had been lost. But what should have been a solemn goodbye quickly turned into something out of a nightmare. At around 11:03 a.m., just over an hour into the service, gunfire suddenly rang out. The heavy silence of mourning was shattered. In an instant, people scrambled for cover, their cries echoing through the church and spilling into the streets. Surveillance footage from outside the church captured the terrifying moment. Mourners were seen entering and leaving, some stepping out for air. Then, within seconds, panic erupted. The video showed attendees fleeing in every direction as bullets tore through the crowd. One woman collapsed to the ground, wounded but desperately crawling for safety. Others screamed as they dove behind cars or rushed back toward the church doors. And then, something even more disturbing appeared on the footage just a few feet from the sanctuary. A masked gunman raised his weapon and fired directly into the crowd. His intent was clear. He wasn't just firing warning shots. He was aiming to kill. What had begun as a farewell for John Hornis spiraled into yet another scene of bloodshed, leaving the community shaken to its core. The shooter showed no mercy. He appeared to target anyone in sight, firing at random with no regard for who might be struck down. It was a calculated ambush carried out right outside a house of worship while a grieving family was simply trying to say goodbye. Outside, terrified screams echoed through the streets. But inside the church, the chaos was just as violent. The service, already heavy with grief, turned into sheer panic. Mourners who moments earlier were weeping quietly now found themselves diving under pews, crawling beneath tables, and clutching loved ones as gunfire rang out beyond the doors. Some tried to reach the exits, others huddled in corners, whispering prayers in desperation. Witnesses said they heard more than a dozen shots. What was meant to be a farewell for John Hornis Jr. had turned into a nightmare of survival. One attendee put it bluntly, "It's senseless to come near a church and open fire like that. These young boys don't care about anyone's life, not even their own." As investigators pieced together what happened, chilling surveillance footage emerged. The video showed two individuals, both dressed head to toe in black and wearing balaclavas, loitering across the street from the church just moments before the shooting began. Prosecutors later identified them as teenagers Hezekiah Nixon and Shaw Davis. For nearly half an hour, the two paced outside a restaurant across from the church, appearing to scope out the scene. One of them was caught on camera openly holding a handgun, while the other appeared to be concealing something beneath his clothing. Then, with calculated precision, they crossed the street, guns in hand, and opened fire into the crowd of mourners. The second figure appeared to conceal something beneath his jacket, likely another firearm. Their pacing wasn't random. Their movements were deliberate, calculated, as if waiting for the perfect moment to unleash violence. And then, in a flash, the waiting ended. Surveillance footage captured the horrifying escalation. The two masked men suddenly raised their weapons and opened fire on the mourners gathered outside the church. The ambush was no spur-of-the-moment act. It was premeditated, timed to cause the most emotional and physical devastation possible. Within moments, 911 calls flooded dispatch. Panic-stricken voices described the chaos outside Destiny of Faith Church. The Pittsburgh Police Department responded within minutes, arriving to a scene of carnage. 5 individuals had been struck by bullets. First responders raced in, tending to the wounded with urgency. Stretchers were rushed in, victims stabilized, and ambulances transported the injured to nearby hospitals. Miraculously, all 5 survived. But while their bodies would heal, the trauma of that day would scar the community forever. As officers began piecing together what had happened, a shocking revelation surfaced. Surveillance footage didn't just capture the shooters. It also caught sight of a black vehicle circling near the church both before and after the attack. Investigators quickly suspected it was the getaway car. Later that same day, police located the black vehicle abandoned near Brighton Heights, only a short distance from the crime scene. Detectives then pored over surveillance footage from surrounding streets, tracing the suspects' movements block by block. The trail eventually led them to McKees Rocks. There, in a residential neighborhood, investigators closed in on their suspects 19-year-old Sean Davis and 16-year-old Hezekiah Nixon. But the two weren't hiding quietly. They were still on the move, attempting to flee. Their escape ended abruptly when traffic on the McKees Rocks Bridge brought their getaway car to a standstill. As officers surrounded them, both suspects stepped out of the vehicle. One of them dropped a handgun to the pavement as law enforcement closed in, sealing their fate. As police closed in on the suspects, one of them tried to conceal the evidence. In a desperate act, he tossed his weapon into the river below. But it was too late. Both Sean Davis and 16-year-old Hezekiah Nixon were arrested on the spot. The charges were severe attempted homicide, aggravated assault, reckless endangerment, and multiple firearms violations. But as detectives dug deeper, a troubling truth surfaced. John's family had feared this very outcome. In the days leading up to the funeral, his loved ones expressed deep concern that violence might follow them even into the church. Rumors were circulating, tensions were rising, and the family formally requested police protection for the service. They were afraid that the pain and anger surrounding John's death could erupt once again. That request was acknowledged. Officers were supposedly assigned to provide security. But when October 28th arrived, the day of the funeral, no one came. Not a single officer stood watch outside Destiny of Faith Church. Law enforcement sources later revealed a stunning mistake. The 2 officers assigned to guard the funeral had mistakenly gone to a different funeral home nearby. Seeing nothing unusual there, they left. And so, when gunfire broke out at Destiny of Faith, the family was left unprotected. Afterward, Pittsburgh Police Major Crimes Commander Richard Ford admitted the failure. Speaking to CBS News, he said, "We look at each situation differently. If there's a request and it falls through the cracks, that's something that has to be immediately looked at." Reporters covering the story echoed what grieving relatives had already said. The family believed officers were supposed to be there, but due to a last-minute reassignment or a breakdown in communication, the protection never came. And because of that failure, what should have been a farewell turned into another scene of terror. After finishing their other assignment, the officers assigned to John's funeral reportedly planned to return to the church. But by the time they were on their way back, the shooting had already erupted. Sources later revealed that it isn't standard procedure for Pittsburgh police officers to attend funerals. However, in this case, someone within the community had clearly anticipated potential trouble. That's why the request for police presence was made in the first place. Even so, the assigned officers were pulled away, and when they tried to make their way back, it was already too late. For many, that explanation wasn't enough. Beth Pittinger, executive director of the Citizen Police Review Board, voiced what so many others were already thinking. Given the violent circumstances of John's death, a public shootout involving multiple gunmen and innocent bystanders, police should have been at the funeral whether a request was made or not. Reports suggest that the 2 officers assigned that day were suspended, though details remain unclear. Were supervisors held accountable? Would this failure lead to real change within the department? To John's grieving family, those unanswered questions only added to their pain. In the days following the funeral, speculation spread. Some suggested John may have been connected to people or circumstances that invited danger, but his loved ones vehemently denied those claims. To them, John was more than surveillance footage and headlines. He was a 20-year-old with a big heart, a young man who loved basketball, who protected his friends, and who was trying to carve out peace in a world that often made it difficult. What should have been a sacred goodbye turned into another crime scene, compounding one tragedy with another. And still, his family chooses to remember him not for how his life ended, but for how he lived. Loyal, loving, and resilient. The heartbreaking loss of John James Hornis Jr. stands as a stark reminder of how quickly disputes can spiral into devastation and why real change is needed to prevent more lives from being stolen too soon. If you found this case compelling, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more true stories like this one.